Evening, June 7th, 1944. Hermanville-sur-Mer, France. Bill Hickman, 24 years old, driving a Bren Gun Carrier through a French seaside town that 12 hours ago was still under German control. They'd told him, "Get through Hermanville fast, don't stop, don't slow down, just go." So Bill went and drove straight into the back of a Churchill tank. A Churchill tank weighs 40 tons. It's basically a mobile building made of steel. Bill's carrier bounced off it like a toy. He chipped a tooth. That was his only injury in the entire war. Think about that for a second. From June 1944 to May 1945, 11 months of combat through Normandy, Holland and Germany. The only time Bill Hickman got hurt was when he rear-ended his own side's tank in traffic. His daughter, Margie Hoffman, calls it a charmed life. But here's the thing about charmed lives in war. Someone has to pay the bill, and it's never the person with the charm. This is Margie's attempt to understand her father. Bill Hickman died in 1991 at 69 years old. Never joined veterans groups, didn't attend reunions, rarely talked about the war, except occasionally, late at night, usually after a few drinks. What Margie remembers most isn't the stories he told. It's the things he couldn't handle. Loud noises. He'd leave the room. Winter. He hated it with an intensity that made no sense. This is England, it's winter half the year. Confidence. He'd lost it somewhere between 1944 and 1945 and never really got it back. He was certainly a changed man when the war was over, Margie writes. And that's the question, isn't it? How does a man walk through some of the bloodiest battles of World War II? Cambers Wood, Goodwood, Overloon, the advance to Bremen, and come home with just a chipped tooth, but completely broken inside? Before we dig into what actually happened, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments. Did your father or grandfather ever talk about feeling guilty for surviving when others didn't? Because that's what this story's really about. We've got two files here. File 1, Margie's account of her father's service. Personal, specific, vivid. Sometimes the dates are fuzzy. That's normal with memories 80 years old. But the emotional details, crystal clear. File 2, 40-plus pages of official records. 2nd Battalion, Middlesex Regiment War Diaries, 3rd Infantry Division movement logs, casualty lists, after-action reports, the cold, bureaucratic documentation of what happened. We're going to place them side by side, see where they match up, figure out what Bill remembered accurately and what memory changed over time, and maybe understand why a chipped tooth was somehow worse than being actually wounded. Here's what makes Bill's story interesting. He wasn't infantry. He wasn't a tanker or a paratrooper. He was support troops, specifically 2nd Battalion Middlesex Regiment, a specialist machine gun battalion. Margie describes them like this. They never fought on their own. They were always attached to other regiments as support troops. They had machine guns, Bren guns and mortars. And she's exactly right. The 2nd Middlesex was the dedicated MG battalion for the British 3rd Infantry Division. Their job was providing the heavy firepower, Vickers machine guns and 4.2-inch mortars, while the infantry did the attacking. These guys were always in the background, always invisible. The people who make the noise so someone else can advance. Which means Bill's story zigzags across multiple battles, multiple brigades. He's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Let's start with how Bill got there. He was called up in 1940 and enlisted with the King's Royal Rifles. Did his training at Winchester. Then came the disaster in France. Margie writes that the King's Royal Rifle Corps lost over 80% of their men killed or captured at Dunkirk. Not quite Dunkirk, but close enough. It was Calais, actually. May 22nd to 26th, 1940. The 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, was part of what's now called a sacrifice force. They were ordered to defend Calais to the last man to draw German panzers away from the main evacuation at Dunkirk. It worked. The battalion got destroyed. When Margie says over 80% lost, she's probably going off what her dad told her. And honestly, that's understated. The 2nd KRRC was effectively wiped out, surrounded, captured, gone. So when Bill talks about being transferred to the Middlesex Regiment during reorganisation, that wasn't bureaucratic shuffling. His original battalion had been erased. He was filling gaps in an army rebuilding from catastrophe. That's verified. The timeline matches. The casualties were real. After the transfer, Bill learned his new job. He could already drive, rare skill in 1940, so they trained him to drive a Bren Gun Carrier, or more accurately, a universal carrier. But everyone called it the Bren Carrier anyway. This was the tracked vehicle that moved the gun crews and their equipment around. Not glamorous, not exciting, just necessary. And because the 3rd Infantry Division's path is completely documented, from Sword Beach on D-Day all the way to Bremen in May 1945, we can follow Bill's entire journey. Every battle, every near miss, every moment the odds said he should be dead. Starting with June 7th, 1944, when he drove into that Churchill tank and chipped his tooth. Then June 9th, 2 days later. Camby's Wood. Bill remembered it clearly. The first battle came a day later at Camby's Wood, fighting alongside the King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Royal Ulster Rifles against the 21st Panzer Division. Let me check that against the records. Battle of Camby's Wood was fought June the 9th, 1944. That's right. The units? 9th Brigade, specifically the 2nd Royal Ulster Rifles and 1st King's Own Scottish Borderers. That's right too. German forces, 12th SS Panzer and 21st Panzer Division. Exactly what Bill said, and the 2nd Middlesex was there providing machine gun support. Bill's naming specific battalions from a chaotic company-level battle on D+3. His memory's photographically accurate, but here's where the story turns dark. Bill had been a personal driver to an officer called Captain Passy for over a year. He knew him. Trusted him. June 9th, Camby's Wood. Officers gathered in an apple orchard to get their orders. Mortar fire came over. Margie writes, "Killed them all, including Captain Passy. This devastated the men who had known him." I looked up the 2nd Battalion Middlesex Regiment casualty list for June 9th, 1944. Major Edmund Lancelot Gerald Passy. Killed in action. He's listed as Major, not Captain. Either Bill remembered the rank wrong, or Passy got promoted recently and Bill still thought of him as Captain. Either way, same man, same day, same apple orchard. Then Margie writes, another officer called McDowell, who had recently heard the news that his son had been born, was sent up as a replacement and got killed almost immediately. Same casualty list, same date. Captain Leonard Gordon McDowell, killed in action, brand new father. Sent forward to replace Passy, dead within hours, maybe minutes. Bill watched both officers die on his first day of combat. And he kept driving his carrier, because that's what you did. That's where this story really begins. Not with the chipped tooth, with Camby's Wood. With Bill learning the lesson that would haunt him for 47 years. Survival is random. Skill doesn't matter. Luck doesn't matter. You just keep waking up while everyone around you doesn't. Captain Passy, who Bill knew for a year, dead. Captain McDowell, brand new father, dead. Bill, who drove into a tank 2 days earlier, alive. Charmed life. And we're just getting started, because from Camby's Wood, Bill's unit pushed through Normandy, Operation Goodwood, then north through Belgium, then Holland for Operation Market Garden, then October 1944, a place called Overloon, where the Americans tried first, lost 500 men, and failed. Then it was Bill's turn. So here's what happened after Cambys Wood. Bill and the 2nd Middlesex kept moving through Normandy, fighting for Caen. Then, Operation Goodwood in July, brutal, grinding battles where tanks got chewed up by the hundreds. Bill's unit provided the machine gun support, the sustained fire that covered the advances. Then, in late summer, they pushed through Belgium. By September, they'd reached Holland. Operation Market Garden. You probably know the story. The bridge at Arnhem, the paratroopers, a bridge too far. But while that drama was happening up north, Bill's 3rd Infantry Division was on the eastern flank. They were trying to secure the operation's right side. Margie writes that they were fighting to get across rivers in the area of Weert, where the bridges had been blown up. I checked the 3rd Division war diaries for September the 1944. There it is, orders for occupation of Weert on September the 20th to 21st. They were securing the eastern flank, exactly like Bill remembered. But here's what the official record doesn't capture: how Bill kept not dying. One day, Bill doesn't say exactly when, could have been Normandy, could have been Belgium. They're told to go down a lane. There's a German sniper somewhere picking off the drivers. Bill's driving his carrier. He makes a decision: leave the road, drive on the grass verge instead. The men he's carrying start screaming, "There's mines there!" Bill keeps going. Nothing happens. No mine, no explosion. The carrier behind him stays on the road, the safe choice. And the driver gets killed by the sniper. There's no after-action report that records this. No documentation of which lane, which day, which specific driver died. These small incidents just disappear into the war. But here's what makes it real. Bill's job was being a target. He drove a universal carrier, open-topped, visible, noisy. And snipers absolutely targeted drivers. Because if you immobilize the carrier, you immobilize the weapon. So the story's plausible. More than plausible, probably. But think about the logic of it. Bill makes the wrong choice. Drives where there might be mines. The other driver makes the right choice. Stays on the road. Bill lives. The other guy dies. Random chance dressed up as decision-making, and it keeps happening. Bill made friends during this time. One was a dispatch rider named Jordan Jordanou, a Greek Cypriot living in London, Margie writes, jokingly known as the only Greek Cockney in the British Army. I love this detail. You can hear Bill telling this story over a pint 50 years later, still affectionate about it, the only Greek Cockney in the British Army. Jordan's job was taking messages between units, which meant riding a motorcycle down country lanes, alone, where German positions might be. Incredibly dangerous work, and every time Jordan had to go, he'd shake Bill's hand and say, "I know I'm going to get killed this time." He never was. Survived the whole war. Lived long enough to have grandchildren. I can't verify Jordan exists in the records we have. Dispatch riders don't show up in casualty lists unless they die, and Jordan didn't die. But the story reveals something important about Bill's war. The joke about dying became routine, became funny almost, because statistically, Jordan should have died. Dispatch riders had terrible survival rates, but he kept coming back. Just like Bill kept coming back. At some point, that stops feeling like luck and starts feeling like something else. Like you're borrowing time that belongs to someone else. By October 1944, the 3rd Division was dug in around a small Dutch town called Overloon. The Americans had tried taking it first. The US 7th Armored Division attacked on September 30th. A week later, they'd lost, Margie's words, about 500 casualties and had to pull out. Let me check that number. The 7th Armoured's attack bogged down in mud and fierce German resistance. After a week, they had to withdraw. Their casualties? Approximately 500. Bill's number is exact, not heavy losses, not many casualties. 500. Then, the British 3rd Infantry Division took over the assault, including Bill's 2nd Middlesex Battalion. There's an Imperial War Museum record that shows a 4.2-inch mortar detachment from the 2nd Battalion Middlesex Regiment's D Company firing southward from Overloon toward Venray. That's Bill's unit, doing their job, providing the heavy fire support. The British soldiers who fought at Overloon gave it a nickname, the Second Caen. That's how bad it was. And somewhere around this time, the weather turned truly awful. Beginning to get extremely wet and cold, Bill told his daughter. There are photographs of him looking fat because he had 3 layers of jackets on. The unit pushed through to a town called Holland, where Dutch civilians ran into the streets to greet them. A moment of celebration. Then back to Overloon, back to Venray, back to the fighting. Margie writes, "A long, cold winter was spent at Overloon." This is where Bill's body started breaking down. It was from this time that my dad experienced stomach pains from the cold. Dad never got over his stomach problems. The winter of 1944 to 45 in Holland was exceptionally brutal. For soldiers, it created a medical crisis: trench foot, frostbite, pneumonia. Bill mentions that too. The intense cold made many men ill. Some had pneumonia. Years later, Bill did his own research and found that German soldiers in Russia experienced similar chronic stomach problems from extreme cold. He was trying to understand what had happened to his body, why he couldn't shake these pains even decades later. The medical explanation is probably a combination: extreme cold suppressing his immune system, terrible sanitation in flooded trenches, bacterial infections like dysentery taking hold. But Bill just knew something broke at Overloon that winter, and it never healed. And there's one more story from Overloon, the worst one maybe. Bill was dug in by a church, defensive position, standard procedure. The men were throwing out bones, much to my dad's horror. That's how Margie writes it. Simple, direct. Throwing out bones. We'll come back to this, because when I looked into what happened at that church, I found something that explains why Bill came home broken. But first, let me tell you about the church itself. The Battle of Overloon culminated on October 14th, 1944. Historical records state, at 4 in the afternoon, the last stronghold, the church, fell in the village of Overloon. The church wasn't just a landmark, it was the final German defensive position. The entire village was completely in ruins by the time it fell. And before the war, the church stood next to the cemetery. Think about that for a second. The battle involved, and this number is documented, more than 100,000 grenades concentrated on the church and the immediate area, 100,000 artillery shells. Hitting a church and the cemetery next to it. When Bill's unit arrived after the fighting stopped, they had to dig defensive positions, slit trenches, foxholes. Because the war wasn't over, they were still under threat of counterattack. They were digging into earth that had been churned by that bombardment, earth mixed with rubble and bones. The bones weren't ancient. They were recently buried civilians of Overloon. The artillery had unearthed the cemetery, and now exhausted British soldiers were using that earth, mixed with human remains, to dig their defensive positions. Bill's men were throwing out bones like rubble because they needed somewhere to sleep that night. Bill was horrified. Of course he was. This detail doesn't appear in any after-action report. The official record says Overloon captured October 14th, 1944. It doesn't say anything about desecrated graves or bones in the dirt, but Bill remembered, because some things you don't forget. And he spent a long, cold winter in that position, at Overloon, where the church had been, where the cemetery was. Stomach pains, pneumonia around him, cold that went into his bones, literally, metaphorically, every way you can mean that phrase. Meanwhile, his charmed life continued. Bill kept surviving, kept driving his carrier, kept watching other people die. Officers in apple orchards, drivers on roads, American soldiers by the hundred, and Bill just kept going. Eventually, spring 1945, the advance continued, through Holland into Germany. The 2nd Middlesex were involved in fighting all the way up to Bremen. Bremen was the end. The 3rd Infantry Division captured the city. The war in Europe ended May 8th, 1945. Bill's service record lists his locations: Normandy, Holland and Bremen. 3 words, 11 months. Cambes Wood, Goodwood, Market Garden, Overloon, Venray, Bremen. 1 chipped tooth. And a mind that never came home. Let's go back to that church at Overloon, because this is where we need to understand what a charmed life actually costs. Bill survived Cambes Wood, where his officers died. He survived the Sniper Lane, where the driver behind him died. He survived 11 months from Normandy to Bremen with 1 chipped tooth. But at Overloon, something happened that surviving couldn't fix. When Bill and his unit arrived at the ruined church to dig in, they were exhausted. Probably half dead themselves from weeks of fighting in the cold and mud. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. They still needed defensive positions in case of counterattack, so they started digging. And the earth they were digging into wasn't just earth anymore. More than 100,000 artillery shells had hit that area. The church was the last German stronghold, so that's where the bombardment concentrated. But the German defenders weren't the only thing buried there. The civilian cemetery, right next to the church, had been there for generations. Overloon was a small farming town. These were local families, people who'd been buried with dignity, with prayers, with grief. Then the war came and churned it all up. Margie writes simply, "The men were throwing out bones, much to my dad's horror." I think this is probably the moment Bill realized what war actually was. Not the propaganda version, not the heroic version, the real version. You don't get to be selective about what gets destroyed. Churches, cemeteries, apple orchards where officers gather, lanes where drivers make wrong choices, none of it's sacred. War grinds through everything and everyone. And if you're the one who survives, you get to remember it all. Bill was horrified by the bones. His men, probably younger, maybe more numb to it by then, just threw them aside and kept digging, because what else were they going to do? Sleep on top of the rubble? But Bill couldn't forget it. Years later, when Margie was old enough to hear these stories, that's one of the ones he told her. The church at Overloon, the bones, the horror of it. Not because it was the worst thing he saw. Maybe it wasn't, but because it was the thing that made him understand. There's no such thing as a clean war. There's no such thing as a charmed life. There's just random survival in a world that's been torn apart. The winter at Overloon broke Bill's body too. The intense cold made many men ill. Some had pneumonia, Margie writes. Bill's stomach problems started then and never went away. The medical explanation isn't complicated. Extreme cold weakens your immune system. Living in flooded slit trenches. Remember, this is Holland in winter. Everything's wet. It creates perfect conditions for infections. Add poor sanitation, irregular food, stress, and you've got a recipe for chronic illness. Dysentery, probably. Maybe gastritis. Something bacterial that got into his system and just stayed. Bill did his own research years later. Found that German soldiers in Russia experienced the same thing. Chronic stomach problems from extreme cold and deprivation. He was trying to understand why his body wouldn't heal. Why, 30 years after Overloon, he still had pains. The answer is, war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It stays in your body, in your gut, in your bones, literally, if you were at Overloon, and in your mind. Margie writes, "He was certainly a changed man when the war was over." Changed how? He seemed to have lost his confidence and he hated noise. For many men, they loved the excitement of the war. Dad was unusual for a Londoner, quiet, softly spoken and sentimental. Let's unpack that. Bill wasn't infantry with a rifle. He was part of a machine gun and mortar battalion. His job was noise. The Vickers heavy machine gun firing sustained support fire. The 4.2-inch mortars lobbing shells. That's loud, industrial, concussive, never-ending loud. Plus the incoming fire. The German mortars that killed Captain Passy in the apple orchard. The 88s. The small arms fire. The explosions. For 11 months, Bill's world was noise. Deafening, unpredictable, deadly noise. So when he came home and couldn't handle loud sounds, that makes sense. Textbook PTSD, hypervigilance. His brain learned that noise equals death, and it never unlearned it. But the lost confidence is more complicated. Why would surviving make you lose confidence? Because the confidence requires believing you have some control, that your choices matter. That skill and intelligence and caution can keep you alive. Bill learned the opposite. He drove into a minefield, lived. He drove on the safe road, someone else died. He stood 65.6 feet from officers in an orchard. They died, he didn't. He survived Overloon, where 500 Americans couldn't. None of that was skill. None of it was courage or intelligence or good decision-making. It was just random. And once you learn that lesson, once you really internalize that survival is random and death is random and nothing you do matters, how do you ever feel confident again? You can't. Because confidence is the belief that you can affect outcomes. And Bill spent 11 months learning that he couldn't. The photograph Margie describes, Bill at Overloon, looking fat because he had 3 layers of jackets on, that's probably the visual summary of this whole story. He's layered up against the cold, trying to protect himself, looking bigger than he really is. But the cold got in anyway, into his stomach, into his bones, into his mind. And the layers didn't protect him from what mattered. The memory of throwing aside bones, of watching officers die, of surviving when he shouldn't have. Margie mentions one more thing that's important. Bill had great sympathy for the Dutch people. When Margie came back from Australia years later with a Dutch husband, Bill was delighted. They were friends for many years. I think that's significant. Bill saw what happened to Holland. To Overloon specifically, the church destroyed, the cemetery desecrated, civilians caught in a battle they didn't start and couldn't stop. And somehow, despite everything, Bill came out of the war with sympathy intact, with the ability to care about other people's suffering, not just his own. That's maybe the only part of the charmed life that was actually a gift. The war didn't make him hard, didn't make him cruel or indifferent. It broke him, but it didn't break his humanity. After Overloon, the 3rd Division kept pushing, through the rest of Holland, into Germany, fighting all the way to Bremen. The war ended May 8th, 1945. Bill came home, quiet, softly spoken, and sentimental. With a chipped tooth, with stomach pains that never went away, with a hatred of noise, with lost confidence, with memories of bones at a ruined church, and with the knowledge that he'd survived when better men like Captain Passy, like Captain McDowell, like the driver who stayed on the road, like 500 American soldiers, hadn't. That's what a charmed life looks like from the inside. Not lucky, not blessed, just haunted. Bill Hickman came home in 1945, got married, had a daughter, built a life in London. His service record lists 3 places: Normandy, Holland, and Bremen. That's it. 3 words for 11 months, for Camby's Wood and Overloon and all the rest. He never joined veterans organizations, never went to reunions, rarely talked about it except late at night, occasionally after a few drinks. Margie grew up watching her father flinch at loud noises, watching him leave the room when something was too much. Noticing that he hated winter with an intensity that seemed strange for England, where it's cold half the year anyway, she didn't understand until later. Being next to so many guns, she writes. Yeah, that'll do it. Bill lived another 46 years after the war ended, died in 1991 at 69. The stomach problems that started at Overloon never went away. That's documented. Margie remembers him having them her entire life. So, in a way, Overloon killed him too. Just took longer. But before he died, he got to meet Margie's Dutch husband. He was delighted, Margie writes. They were friends for many years. I love that detail. After everything Bill saw happen to Holland, the destruction, the bones at the church, the civilians caught in battles they never asked for, he still had enough warmth left to be delighted his daughter married a Dutchman. The war broke him, but it didn't destroy his capacity for sympathy, for connection. That matters. So what did we learn? We started with a story that sounded almost absurd. A man who survived 11 months of combat, with his only injury being a chipped tooth from driving into a friendly tank. And we found out it was true. Bill's unit, 2nd Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, that's confirmed. Specialist Machine Gun Battalion supporting the 3rd Infantry Division. That's confirmed. The battles he fought in, Cambers Wood on June 9th, 1944. Normandy Campaign, Operation Market Gardens Eastern Flank near Weert. The Battle of Overloon, after the US 7th Armoured lost 500 men and had to withdraw. The advance to Bremen, all confirmed. The deaths he witnessed, Major Edmund Lancelot Gerald Passy, killed June 9th, 1944. Captain Leonard Gordon McDowell, killed the same day. Both names are in the casualty lists exactly where Bill remembered them. The church at Overloon, confirmed as the final German stronghold. The cemetery next to it, confirmed. The bombardment of over 100,000 shells, confirmed. Bill's memory was nearly perfect. The big stuff he got exactly right. Some details shifted a bit. He said Dunkirk when he meant Calais, but both are 1940 defeats, and in his mind they probably blurred together. That's normal. That's how memory works. The unverifiable stuff, Jordan, the Greek Cockney dispatch rider, the specific Sniper Lane incident, those probably happened too. They fit the pattern of everything else. They sound like real stories, not invented ones. Bill wasn't exaggerating. If anything, he was understating. And here's what the official records can't capture. What it felt like to stand in an orchard 65.6 feet away while mortar fire killed your officers. What it felt like to survive a minefield while the guy behind you didn't. What it felt like to dig a defensive position and throw aside human bones. What it felt like to spend a winter so cold it damaged your body permanently. What it felt like to come home with one chipped tooth and feel guilty about it for the rest of your life. The after-action reports don't record that. They just say, Overloon captured October 14th, 1944. But Bill remembered, and Margie remembered watching her father remember. If you're watching this in the UK, and you served, or your father did, your grandfather, you might know these places. Overloon, Venray, the push through Holland, the advance into Germany. Maybe you were 3rd Division. Maybe you were with a different division. Maybe you were support troops like Bill, signals, transport, engineers, medical, machine guns. Maybe you've heard stories like Bill's, about surviving when you shouldn't have, about friends who didn't make it, about coming home changed. Yeah. Margie writes that her father was unusual for a Londoner, quiet, softly spoken, and sentimental. But after reading through all these records, I don't think he was unusual at all. I think he was typical. I think lots of men came home quiet, having lost their confidence, unable to handle noise. The difference is, Margie wrote his story down. Most families don't. The official histories record divisions and dates. 3rd Infantry Division, landed Sword Beach, June 6, 1944. Participated in operations, Overloon, October 1944. War ended, Bremen, May 1945. Clean, precise, bureaucratic. But the real history is in details like Bill's stomach pains that lasted 46 years, in his hatred of winter, in his inability to be around loud noises, in his great sympathy for the Dutch people because he'd seen what happened to their country. That's the history the official records miss. The cost measured in decades, not days. In flinches and stomach pains and lost confidence. In men who survived with charmed lives and never felt lucky. There's probably a photograph somewhere, I imagine it anyway, of Bill in post-war London, standing outside his house, maybe 1950s, 1960s, ordinary civilian life. And if you looked at that photo, you'd see an ordinary man, quiet, softly spoken, nothing remarkable. You wouldn't see Camby's Wood, you wouldn't see the bones at Overloon, you wouldn't see the drivers who died or the officers in the orchard or the winter that broke his body. But they're all there, in the way he stands maybe, in his eyes. The 2nd Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, was eventually disbanded after the war. Their specialist role, divisional machine gun support, got absorbed back into regular infantry units. But Bill carried Overloon with him until 1991. Carried the cold, the noise, the guilt of surviving, the bones. Margie wrote his story to remember her father, to understand why he was the way he was. Now we know. The chipped tooth was real. The charmed life was real. And the cost, measured in stomach pains and lost confidence, and 46 years of hating winter, that was real too. All of it. Even the parts Bill wished he could forget.